Well, welcome back to the channel, everybody. It's late March here in Niagara Falls, and it is chilly out. It's only about 3 degrees Celsius maybe at most. But that gives me a chance to get into the shop and get some work done on this KLF400 Bayou. Now this bike needs the oil changed in the front and rear differentials. And I'm going to show you how to do that today on this bike. So sit back, grab yourself something warm to drink, and enjoy Dino's Tinker Shed. Let's get dirty. With the Bayou 400 back in the Tinker Shed, I have a bunch of projects that I want to work on over the next few weeks. Some of them are fairly simple and some of them are more complex. Today's project that I want to look at is changing the oil in the front and rear final drives. Now, I rebuilt these final drives last winter. I don't have any video footage of it. However, I was finding that there was water contamination within the oil of the front and rear final drives. Now the front wasn't too bad, but the rear was really getting to be nasty. It had a lot of milky white water within the actual oil when I would drain it. And even worse, it was starting to leak out so bad that it contaminated the rear drum brake, making it pretty much useless and necessitating me changing the actual shoes and all that drum out because it was so contaminated. So I'm pretty excited to get in there and see if I'm getting any water in after a season of use last year. Now, when I start doing these types of projects, I always refer back to a manual. And if you've ever watched any of my other videos, you know that I'm a big proponent of buying a service manual, especially for an older piece of equipment like this. It really helps you out to understand how the bike works. General information, things as simple as overall dimensions and weight, are available within the manual. But there's a lot of other great information that you can use even on other projects. There are things like conversion tables from metric to imperial here. There's a whole list of technical abbreviations. So if you want to know what TDC stands for, you can look that up and realize it's top dead center. Now there's also in this manual some really odd things. There's even a wind chill chart that shows you how cold it feels when you're riding the machine at different temperatures and different speeds. It's really kind of a neat chart to have, and it's in that manual. However, today what I'm really interested in is fluids. I want to know what type of fluid and how much fluid I need to fill up the front and rear final drives of this Bayou. When you read the manual, what it will tell you is you need to use a GL5 SAE gear oil in the front and rear final drives. Now, gear oil is different from engine oils and other lubricants in that it has a lot of additives that allows it to survive the extreme pressures of gears meshing on gears, which is really what your final drives do. Don't make the mistake and use straight 90 weight engine oil in your front and rear final drives. It really is not robust enough to handle that type of extreme conditions that your final drives produce. So go out and buy actual gear oil. I have had a hard time finding straight 90 weight gear oil for a number of years, and ADW90 seems to be what most department stores and automotive stores that I shop at carry. So I've been using ADW90 for a number of seasons. What the ADW90 means is when the gearbox is cold, so first thing in the morning, the fluid is going to act as if it is an 80 weight oil. It's going to actually flow a little better than 90 weight in cold temperatures. The viscosity is similar to an 80 weight oil. However, as the gearbox comes up to temperature, it actually has the viscosity of a 90 weight oil, meaning it's a little bit thicker at higher temperatures. Not thicker in terms of when it's cold, but it matches the viscosity of a true 90 weight oil at operating temperatures. So you kind of get the best of both worlds with an ADW90. And this is what I'm going to use in my final drives today. The other thing the manual is going to tell you is the fluid capacity for both the front and the rear final drives. Some bikes are different. They actually will tell you to fill to spill, which means you just keep filling it until it spills out the fill hole, and that means that the final drive's full. This Kawasaki actually gives you specific volumes for both the front and rear final drives. If you look in the manual, what you're going to see is in 1993, when this bike first came out, and which is the model I have here, the front final drive only held 250 milliliters of oil. From 1994 on to when the model was finally discontinued, they increased that capacity to 400. So if you add 400 milliliters to this particular bike, it's overfilled. You don't want to do that. It only has room for 250 milliliters. Interestingly enough, the rear final drive on all models only holds 200 milliliters. It actually holds less than the front differential no matter what year the bike is. I find that kind of funny because I always think the rear differential actually is going to do a little more work and probably could benefit from additional oil. But that's not the case. What this means is you're going to need a couple extra tools to actually fill the front and rear differentials. I always have a measuring cup, and this isn't one that I use in the kitchen, and I have an assortment of different funnels. Often this black funnel here, this little one, will work fine. However, last year, my brother-in-law and I built a custom front winch bumper for this particular bike. Now, there isn't one available on the market, so we built one out of 1/4-inch plate steel and mounted it up to the front of the bike. What this did is it limited our ability to get to the fill hole for the front final drive, meaning that I'm going to have to use a transmission funnel to actually fill that. And these are really handy if you've never used one of these. They're flexible, they have a mesh screen in there to keep contaminants out, and it will allow me to sneak it down into the hole and fill this thing with relative ease. Now, if you don't have any of this, you can always just add the amount of oil you need into one of these containers and use the little spout on the top to fill them. But I find that the funnel and the measuring cup works best for me and this bike. I'm going to start here at the rear final drive. It's a little easier to get to, and I should be able to show you a little easier how the process is done. The front is done exactly the same. The only difference is the amount of fluid that I'm going to fill it up with. So let's walk through this one. The first thing that you need to understand is the manual recommends that you take the bike out and ride it. Warm the differentials up. So take it out for 20 minutes, half an hour, until those final drives come up to temperature. Unfortunately, I'm not able to do that today, so I'm going to have to do this cold. It's not the right way to do it. However, today it's going to be the only way that I can. I don't have anywhere to ride this thing around Niagara Falls. It really spends its life up north. The reason you want to warm these differentials up is it allows that fluid to flow better, like we talked about earlier with the 90 weight and 80 weight. When it's up to temperature, it flows much easier, and any contamination that's actually sitting on the bottom of the final drives is flushed out much better with warm oil. Now, because I'm not doing that, I'm running the risk of leaving some contamination in the bottom end of these final drives, but it's a risk that I'm willing to take, mostly because I had these cracked open last year and I know that there really wasn't a lot of contamination in them to begin with, so I'm pretty comfortable just changing the oil out. All right, let's get moving on this. To do this job, you want to make sure that the quad is on level ground and it's sitting on its tires. Now I'm going to take off the skid plate here. You can see there's an access hole for both a socket and the draining oil, but I want to take this off just to maybe make it a little easier to film so you can see things a little easier. Now, I really forgot how hard this thing is to get back on, and I pay for this later in the video. But once I get the skid plate off, you can kind of see again where that big access hole is. and the drain hole on the bottom, so you don't have to take this off, and I would recommend probably not doing this. But here's the drain plug itself. Now this is a 17 millimeter socket to break this thing open. So the way you do this is you put a drain pan underneath that bolt, you break the bolt free, and then let the oil drain out. I also, once I get the oil moving, then I'll take off the fill plug, which is just above my hand there, and that allows the air to get in a little easier and it drains a little bit faster. But you can see it takes about 10 minutes for this stuff to come out of there, and it really is dark brown. It's not really the nicest looking stuff, but there's no metal contaminants in it. And also, the lubricity still feels really good. I don't think there's any water in this. I think there's just some kind of maybe a little bit of mud or something on the inside of the case that I forgot to clean last time. So I'll rethread this in, and I'll torque this bolt down. First I'll snug it up, and then I'll torque it down to its torque specs, which is 20 Newton meters or 15 foot-pounds of torque. Once that's done, I'll just fill up some new ADW90 gear oil. You can see how nice and clean this is. It looks like corn syrup. And then I'll clean my funnel to make sure that there's no contaminants, any dirt or dust in that funnel. And you're going to see just how thick this stuff really is. I had to fill the funnel, I don't know, 3 or 4 times here, because it just takes so long for it to drain down into the final drives. This is what makes this stuff so amazingly tacky inside the actual drive itself and keeps the gears lubricated. Once I do fill it up, you're going to be able to see that that 200 milliliters of fluid is right at the very top of the fill hole. So it really is a fill to spill, but I just use the right amount. Now the fill cap itself does have an O-ring on it, but it still does get torqued down. So I'll snug it down here and follow it up with a torque wrench at 29 Newton meters or 21 foot-pounds. Now I'm going to clean the bolts up here first for the skid plate and put a generous amount of anti-seize on these. They do sit a lot of the time underwater. And I'll just line up all the bolt holes and put this thing in. It's really easy, right? Well, no. As I said earlier, this thing was a pain in the butt. It probably took me longer to put this skid plate on than it did to actually service both the front and rear differentials. Like, it was crazy. I think it took me almost half an hour to get this thing back on. Now, what I think's probably happened is over the lifespan of this machine, it's probably taken a couple hits on that skid plate, either a rock or a large log or something that's been traversed. And it's just tweaked this skid plate enough that I can only get 2 of the 3 bolts in at any given time. Now a smart person would probably have taken this skid plate over to the bench and slightly enlarged the holes so it gives a little bit of clearance. But me not being all that smart here, I think I'm going to win, so I just get the jack out and I put some pressure on the bottom and start hammering on this thing. And eventually I do get it to fit. But the next time I get this thing off, I think I'm just going to enlarge the holes just slightly so it makes it fit a little bit better. Even if I have to put a couple washers on the bottom to make up the difference, I think it will make it a lot easier for me moving forward. That was really hard to get back on. Wow. The last thing I'm going to do is just roll the bike back and forth a few times to make sure that new oil coats the gears well. Sometimes you just take it out for a ride, but again, I can't do that, so this is just going to have to suffice. After the frustration on getting on that skid plate on the rear, I took a break, and I highly recommend if you get frustrated, just take a break. So it's the next day, and I'm going to get to work on the front final drive on this KLF400. This normally would involve taking the skid plate off of the front, but again, we put on a custom front winch bumper, which makes taking that front skid plate a little bit difficult. So instead of doing that, I'm just going to use an assortment of universal joints, a small socket, and a small extension on a 3/8 drive ratchet, and you can actually sneak in from the side and get the drain plug out. This is a little bit messy. It's going to drain down onto the skid plate and then find its way down into the drain pan. However, I think it's going to be okay. So again, if you have a stock KLF400, you should probably take that front skid plate off. I'm not going to do that, but I am going to drain that oil. Let's get working on that now.
I'll just pull the front drain bolt out here and let's have a look at it.
One thing that I've noticed right away with this front final drive is the oil definitely has a little bit of water in it. And you can tell that because there's a milky white residue in the oil. It almost looks like a milkshake. So I'm not sure. I did the seals on this last year, but somehow I'm still getting water penetration. I'm going to have to take a closer look at this over the summer. Maybe one of the vent hoses is off or something like that, and it's getting some water penetration in there. It doesn't appear to be a lot of oil, or sorry, a lot of water, but it's enough that it concerns me. I don't want any water in the front or rear end. Anyway, the oil's just about drained out. I'm going to put the drain plug back in, and you'll notice, I didn't point this out on the first one, but there is a crush washer on these that seals these drain plugs. The manual says replace it if it's damaged. Some people will say to replace that crush washer every time you have it off. I've never had a problem with that leaking if I torque it down to the right torque settings. So I'm just going to reuse this one again, and hopefully it will continue to seal. Okay, let's get this back in and fill this front up.
Reinstalling the drain bolt was really a lot easier than I thought, and I was able to get it started quite easily by hand. After that, I chased the bolt back up to the mating surface here with a ratchet, and then followed this up again with the torque wrench, torquing the drain bolt down to 20 Newton meters of force. Now, this wasn't a lot of throw here, but I did manage to get it done. Once that's done, it's really just a matter of adding some fresh oil and capping it off.
You know, there's just a little bit left in this container here, but when these are finally empty, I tend to keep them. They're very handy bottles to have, especially with this little fill spout on the top. What I normally use these for is I will fill them up and relabel them with chainsaw bar oil. Now, obviously a full-time professional arborist or forester, this isn't enough oil for a day's cutting, but for a weekend warrior, this works pretty good. You can fill these up, and that little spout on the end makes filling your oil reservoir on your saw really, really easy. It's just something to think about. You know, it's not always about recycling. Sometimes it's about reusing.
Here you can really see the benefits of this transmission funnel. I'm able to snake it down into the fill hole and actually wedge it up against the tire here, and it just stayed in place. Here again you can see how thick this oil is, and the one challenge with a transmission funnel is the screen that's in there really does slow down the filling of this thing. It took about 15 minutes for that to finally fill, but once that's done, I can take the funnel out, replace the actual filler cap and torque that down to spec, and you know what? We're just about done here. I think the job's done.
Okay, there we go. Wow, this whole girl is heavy. And that brings us to the end of today's episode on how to change the oil in your front and rear final drives on this KLF400 Bayou. I would say that most ATVs out there have some kind of similar system, but they all do vary a little bit different. So do yourself a favor, get yourself a shop manual, or at least get onto some forums and do a bit of research before you tackle something like this. Now again, the manual does say to change your oil in your final dries once a season. However, if you're in really wet conditions, let's say you've got it snorkeled and you do a lot of mud running, or maybe up in the muskeg up in northern Ontario, you may want to do that more frequently, just to keep an eye on what's happening within those final dries and get any water that may have gotten in there flushed out so it doesn't damage your ring and pinion gears in there. Okay, well until next time, I've got a few more things that I need to do on this Bayou before we put it into service. I hope that you had yourself a good time watching, and if you did, leave some comments. I'd love to hear if I'm on the right track here, and I'll see you soon back here at Dino's Tinker Shed. Okay, on to the next thing.